Okay, good morning everyone. Can I welcome you to the 22nd meeting in 2013 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind everybody to switch off their mobile phones and devices as they do affect the broadcasting system. Some members of the committee, however, will be using their notes on tablet form, so that's why they're allowed to access them. Before we move to agenda item 1, I'd like to acknowledge the very positive announcement of the Minister of Transport and Veterans last week of the £1 million fund in this financial year for the replacement of community transport vehicles. Providing such a fund, as you know, was a key recommendation in the committee's Community Transport Inquiry report, and that announcement, taken together with the doubling of funding for the CTA and other positive Scottish Government responses, represents, I think you'll agree, a very positive outcome for our inquiry and for the community transport sector. So agenda item 1 this morning is the Procurement Reform Bill, and we're going to hear evidence today from a range of bodies representing contracting authorities and organisations. This item will take the format of a round-table discussion, which is intended to allow the free flow of discussion. There will be no opening statements from witnesses. They will be asked to introduce themselves and their organisation, and this will be followed by an open discussion, prompted perhaps by questions from committee members on various provisions of the bill. So we'll try as far as possible to work through, through the sections of the bill. We obviously have a wide range of witnesses from different sectors, and we hope our questioning will, as I say, cover cross-cutting themes. So to make best use of our time, I would ask witnesses to avoid restating in detail points raised by other witnesses that they agree with. But I'd also like to emphasise that if anyone feels that anything has been missed during the session, they can follow that up with a submission in writing. So going round the table, I will ask the witnesses to briefly introduce themselves and who they represent. So obviously I'm Maureen Watt, I'm convener of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Karen.
I'm Karen Bowman, I'm the Director of Procurement at the University of Edinburgh. I've been working in public procurement in Scotland for 30 years.
I'm Mark Griffin, I'm a member of the committee.
I'm Angus Warren, I'm the Chief Executive of Advanced Procurement for Universities and Colleges, which is the Centre of Procurement Expertise and representative body for procurement for the higher and further education sectors across Scotland.
Mary Fee, MSP, I'm a member of the committee.
Good morning, I'm Dorothy Cowie, the Director of Scotland Excel. That's the Centre of Expertise for all 32 local councils.
Alec Johnson, another member of the committee.
George Ecton, I represent the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Gray, Sustainability and Energy Officer at East and Bartonshire Council and Chair of the Sustainable Scotland Network, which is who I'm representing today.
John MacDonald, member of the committee.
Susan Torrance, Policy Manager, Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, representing our members, which range from 20-unit Abbey Fields to Glasgow Housing Association. So a wide range of sizes and types of organisation, but all housing associations.
Jimmy D, MSP for Edinburgh Southern, and a member of the committee.
Colin Sinclair, I'm Director of National Procurement, which is the Centre of Expertise for Procurement in NHS Scotland and representing the 22 health boards.
Okay, and this is Adam Ingram, MSP Vice Convener of the committee. Okay, as I said, we'll try and go through the bill as it is in sections, but maybe if I could start off by asking you all, what do you think the overall impact of the bill will be on your organisation? Anyone like to start? Susan?
Can I begin by saying that a number of our members are extremely concerned. We did take sounding board meetings throughout October, and obviously the bill was published in good time for us to talk through some of the implications. But I think, given that we're still wrestling with the concept of being included within the EU thresholds, to suddenly find another set of thresholds and another set of duties and obligations, people are finding that difficult in terms of understanding what it will mean in terms of cost and in terms of how they organise their businesses. And there is a great feeling of things being imposed on them rather than they themselves seeing that some of the measures will assist their procurement efficiencies.
use the portal at the moment, for example?
Public Contract Scotland, yes, they do, but they do that because they choose to do that because it assists their businesses. And I think that the idea that they are to be swept or indeed remain swept, because there's quite a complicated debate or legal reason why housing associations are deemed public contracting authorities. But as I say, to have measures that are applicable to health service, NHS trusts and universities and local authorities on very small associations, many of whom are charities and work in the third sector and really are using every spare penny that they have in terms of assisting tenants and moving forward their social and community objectives. They see some of the procurement measures as being bureaucratic, extra cost and causing them difficulties.
Okay, anyone else? Yes, Karen.
We're very appreciative of the original consultation on the bill, and a lot of the areas that we had concerns about were taken into account in the final version. But there are a couple of key matters that, for our university in particular, and Angus can speak on behalf of the whole sector, that we still do have some concerns about, and that is primarily the impact on our academic research community. In that we are competing for funding in the current year. Last full year we received £300 million of research funding, and our competitors in the rest of the UK are currently being advised that they will not need to apply the European rules, never mind any rules at lower thresholds. And also we know that, although we've not seen the final text, the European Union is simplifying and opening up some of the procedures at the higher value of EU thresholds. So we do have a concern that our research colleagues will have to carry out extra procedures that they don't currently have to do, that their competitors in the rest of the UK won't have to do, and it may add bureaucracy and costs to the university.
I think from a health perspective, at a national level, everything I think that's in the bill would be regarded as good practice and what we would be anticipated and expected to do. So in terms of an impact on my organisation directly, we hope we do in the vast majority of what's in here just now. I think the significant risk is the proportionality of what the ask will be on individual health boards of varying size and scale, and the risk, I think, of significant bureaucracy. And also, does that meet the desire of the bill to promote SME and third sector and supported business activity, or could it actually have a negative impact in terms of some of the remedy suggestions? So I think my overriding view of it is the proportionality of what's being asked of contracting authorities, and will it support the key principles on the bill, and maybe there's other ways to do it.
So are you saying thresholds are too low, or?
No, I think there's a risk. If I give an example, in a lot of the health boards, they will receive a large number of tenders for a relatively small value of contract. Now what they will be asked to do under the bill is do a significant amount of additional administration, potentially have to do a significant amount of additional meetings, and then potentially could end up with threats of going to court and remedies, which actually I think in practice may put SMEs off, because they may see the option of going to court if they're unhappy as unaffordable, as kind of actually inhibits their ability to get involved, rather than I think what we hoped for was maybe a kind of ombudsman approach and more of a supporting SMEs to be able to get better access to contracts and supporting their ability to win contracts.
But SMEs wouldn't go to court unless they were unhappy with the contracting, the award of the contract. They wouldn't go if they won the contract. So I'm not...
No, but I think the risk is that you get... Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is that you could end up going to court. An incumbent supplier could go to court for a relatively small amount of money simply to retain the business for a period of time until any court action issue was resolved. And I think the other issue is the cost to unsuccessful bidders. If you're contracting for a 50 grand contract over, say, a 4-year period, it's kind of 12k a year for the supplier. If he's unsuccessful and feels that it's not been carried out properly, the cost of actually going through a court process and a remedies process actually would probably put them off complaining and may not then actually drive the improvement in the procurement process that the bill, I think, is intended to try and do, and which we all support.
What have they got now?
At the moment, they have a remedy through the single point of inquiry, and certainly what we suggested previously, and I think other parties did, was have an ombudsman approach, have a more proactive approach with the public sector, going out to support SMEs in how to complete contract tender documentation, how we give them the best chance to be successful in ultimately what's a competitive situation. So I suppose much more of a proactive approach to our suppliers and to help them and build relationship and help them to fill in tender forms to understand the issues that they have, rather than leaving it to, if they're unhappy, they go to a court solution or potentially go to a court solution, which may be prohibitive to them for cost reasons.
And if there are more bidders for the contracts, does that not mean better use of public money, because you're likely to get a wider range of bidders and a wider range and possibly a more competitive situation on price?
I think there's a practicality issue if you get, as we have had, 40, 50, 60 bidders coming in for relatively small size contracts, that the ability of the tendering organisation, the procurement organisation, to then go through that, to understand each of the offers, to then have to do all the administration that goes with it, whereas a number of those companies may not actually be capable of doing it in the first place. So the risk is it just adds to administration and frustration rather than takes that away and not necessarily give you a more competitive situation.
Is that not what the PQQ is all about?
The PQQ will endeavour to do that, but the standard PQQ will ask a range of standard questions, but in most procurements you then have to ask some specific questions. So if there's too much focus on the standard questions, then everybody gets through the PQQ, and that's a risk that we need to look at. That's a proportionality issue again.
Okay, anyone else? Yes, Dorothy.
Sorry, Angus, I'll go first. I really just echo Colin's comments about the impact on my organisation, Scotland Excel, given the nature of the contracts that we do and the high value. I think the implications not significant, but just as Colin said, the impact on local councils. I think there have been some concerns raised, and I know that the Scottish Local Government Procurement Forum, which is the forum with all the heads of procurement, have submitted some evidence, and those concerns mirror the points that Colin's just made.
Yeah, I mean, again, just to follow up and maybe just to explain where we think that some of the challenges are around the remedies. Although going to a full court case can take a lot of money, you can actually stop a process very quickly in the Sheriff Court for a few £100. And one of the challenges on that subject is if an incumbent supplier was to win, or was to lose business, then it will, and it was £50,000 worth of business, they can, for an investment of £500, they could potentially delay the process for a couple of years and receive the income for a further period of years, even though they know they have no grounds. And that's one of the risks with the remedies. Whereas at the moment there's a remedy to go to the single point, well, first of all to liaise with the contracting authority, to go to the single point of inquiry, and then to go to court at the moment to seek damages. But the ability to stop the process could be very damaging, particularly if it was going back to Karen's example, where if it was for a very urgent piece of research, very high profile research, and the research was then stopped for a significant period of time because of a small challenge in a sheriff court. The researchers would most likely in that scenario just simply take the research and go outside of Scotland to another university. Research is mobile, so it goes with the researcher, not with the institution. So it's a very high risk area. I mean, going on to the...
Can I just ask on that point? You've been involved with the government in discussions prior to this bill being published. Have you been given any commitment that an exemption for contracts in pursuit of research or experimental development will be given?
Not a commitment as such, but they have said that they would like to, through regulation, be able to include, well, they would certainly give a serious consideration to exemption. The concerns we have around research are that it's so essential for the well-being of the Scottish higher education sector. It's a very successful sector. It's a real asset to the Scottish nation. in every area, in teaching and research, knowledge transfer, spin-outs, it is way above the rest of the UK at the moment. And we're concerned that a lot of that is grounded in the research. And if we start to do things which could have an impact on the research, it can have a great effect on the wider situation within universities. The other thing about our sector is that a significant amount of the income comes from competitive sources. So, for example, in higher education, less than 35% of the funding is from the Scottish Government. The rest is competitively won. And even when you take in the college sector, it's still 58% is competitively won income, including both sectors. And and even outside of the research area, then additional work required to go through a lot of the processes will present a significant risk of making us less competitive when, as Karen mentioned, the rest of the UK higher education sector will come out of the EU procurement rules because of the change to their funding model. Some universities have already started to come out this year, and the rest will follow very soon once they see the advantages that those pulling out are now getting in procurement terms. So the impacts are quite significant and entirely probably unintended. It's a challenge of rolling us in as a competitive sector into a sector which is predominantly public sectors. And that's the real problem you see. Going into, I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail. Obviously, I've submitted a paper.
If the government are giving you a commitment that under the regulations, because this bill, because of its very nature, is going to be pretty high level, and a lot of the stuff will be left, of the detail will be left to the regulations. If you're given that exemption, would that cover it?
I think it all depends on what the exemption actually says and how widely we can interpret the exemption. We would like, I mean, and we would be very grateful if we could get an exemption for research, because that does present the biggest risk area. I mean, obviously the other areas are also a risk to a degree through the additional bureaucracy required. One of the challenges we feel is that a lot of the good practices, the regulation and the bureaucracy is meant to framework and support, is already being done in the sector, and through policy and through sectoral policy as well. So we're already doing a lot of that. In fact, virtually everything from an outcomes basis we're already doing. So we're already achieving very good outcomes. So we feel that and that's without the additional cost of the compliance aspects. I mean, we appreciate the government, and if I was a civil servant in the directorate, I would probably want to keep things as simple as possible and as consistent as possible as well. So I appreciate where they're coming from. And I also appreciate, as Karen mentioned, that a lot of the original areas of concern have been taken out. So the consultation process has been a very good process. It's been well managed, and it's just that we have these areas remaining. And we do feel that it might be that some of them can be adapted to be slightly more flexible, and maybe even allow the centres of expertise to have a slight role in maybe understanding where things should be applied and where they shouldn't be applied, where we have a more detailed understanding of how things work in the sector, and where competition exists and where it doesn't exist. But the main concerns are obviously based on our situation as being in a competitive environment. Interestingly, if you look at things like the utilities, where they have a much more light touch regime, and this, I believe, isn't to be applied to them. It's the main justification across Europe but especially in the UK for exempting them is because they're in a competitive situation. But the higher and further education sectors are in a far more competitive situation on an international scale, which is growing every year in the ferocity of the competition.
A lot of the competition you do for research and development is, not just a single university. It's together with another university in Scotland, another university in England, or indeed another university in the EU, or indeed in the world. So, if it's EU regulations, then they're all going to be covered by the same regulations, are they not? Well,
England won't be covered going forward, so the English universities will be able to come out, and many of the European countries actually don't apply the EU procurement rules to the university sectors in their countries. Britain it obviously has done from the beginning, but certain other countries, when we speak to people in universities in other countries like France, Spain, Portugal, I haven't met anyone yet in the sector in these countries who is having to comply with the EU rules even now. I think in Northern Europe it might be slightly different, but a lot of the universities there are actually state-owned, so it's a slightly different scenario. The danger is that if we have a level of bureaucracy that to partner with a university in Scotland, if there are additional delays in bureaucracy, then if say, 2 universities in London, one in France, one in America are looking to partner, they'll think, well, let's go with the ones that can move fast and can start the research fast, not have a risk of the research being stopped because of a challenge for a minor piece of equipment within the research process.
That's happening now, then? Is that what you're saying?
Could I come in on this point? Is that okay? Is that okay, Angus? Yeah. What we do at the moment, and certainly in Edinburgh, we've got a good reputation for managing, whether it's research funding or private donations, very well and transparently, and we're applying the public procurement law, the EU regulations at that threshold already. And I think what we try to do is get good competition for our colleagues in the research community. But quite frequently, there is really quite a narrow competition. It's very specialised equipment and so on. And I think we don't have any problem with applying that at that threshold. It's bringing the threshold down to around this 50,000 mark or a £2 million potential refurb project on one of our buildings. Actually, we'd still do competition at the moment, and we would be very happy to do that. It's the statutory obligations around the pre-procurement work and also then the debriefing work that is not really adding value to the university or to our suppliers. And I think the issue about collaborative procurement is we in Edinburgh University have over 100 nationalities of people, and they come and go as and when funding flows, and if it's easy for them to do business, they will go where it's easy to do business. And I think that's one of the worries that Angus has been highlighting, that the staff are mobile, the research will go with them, particularly within the UK. We've already had teams move to other universities and their funding does go with them. So we would want in Scotland to build on our good reputation that we've already had, and I know it's been recognised by Mr Eadie and others in the Parliament that Edinburgh is now a leading university in the world, and we want to make it easy for people to come here and do research, easy for suppliers in Scotland and the rest of the UK to supply us. And I think anything that makes it more difficult, more tricky, slower, will actually be to the detriment. But it's not about trying not to be transparent in the way we spend public money in particular. And I think my understanding, and I may be wrong, that the European regulations that are going to be changed in the new directives are likely to make it easier for non-central bodies to introduce procedures that we used to have, the negotiated with call for competition and the negotiated without call for competition, and innovative partnerships, which are all things that will be very helpful to universities. So above EU level, even if the Scottish institutions are still part of the EU procurement rules, it will be more flexible than it appears to be in the bill. And obviously if the Scottish Government produce regulations that exclude research contracts or procurement for research, that will be very helpful and very welcome. The challenge then for people like myself is, when we're procuring something, is it for research, or is it for teaching, or is it for administration, or is it used for all three of those functions? And quite a lot of things, particularly high-performance computing and so on, has a mixture of applications. Microscopes are used in labs for teaching as well as for research. So the impact on the research economy of Scotland is the one that we're most concerned about, but the practical applications of the procedures required in the bill will add costs to the university and others in our sector. And we have, for example, in Edinburgh, 171 companies in the last 5 years have been created, mainly in Scotland, but also elsewhere. Those companies could be supplying us, and now their business would be open to competition at quite a low level, where perhaps in the past that wouldn't have been the case.
Okay, well, I can certainly take that up with the Cabinet Secretary when she comes before us, once we've taken all our evidence. Sylvia, you...
On that same vein, what you said is research is very competitive, etc. But how much of it is based on the wealth of experience that an organisation, a university particularly, has, or if it's a certain of excellence? I mean, how much weighting is actually put on purely on price when you're assessing, when somebody is assessing where research should go?
I'd like to answer that, if that's possible, on behalf of Edinburgh, but also my experience of working in the university sector now for 15 years. Research is very competitive, and it's assessed on two main things. One is the research excellence of the individual who is the principal investigator, their track record and their team's track record in the particular academic area. So it's done on a peer review basis by the quality of research. But more and more, our research funding bodies, particularly government funding through research councils, European Union and charity funding, are looking very much at value for money in the funding of the research. So the full economic costs of research now have to be bid. And if the University of Edinburgh, for example, is expensive as a place to run research because if we were less efficient in our use of resources, that would be to the detriment. The weighting on individual cases really depends on the specific kind of research. And the institution's reputation is a big part of that, obviously. And we've been very successful in that. But I think the two elements are the academic excellence and the efficiency, if you want to call it that, in terms of value for money. And the track record that we have of having conducted multi-million pounds procurement, over 150 to 180 million pounds of procurement a year, efficiently, effectively, compliantly, obviously has weight. But more important is the academic community and their ability to deliver the research quickly, because speed is another element. Often these funding opportunities are very short, the bidding process is very short, and the application, getting research published, is the main purpose, and that has to be done as quickly as possible. I don't know if that answers your question.
Just one thing to add as well is I used to work in a university, and one of the things when researchers were considering coming to work at a university was questions they would ask around agility of being able to manage their research budget. So if they had a research grant, then they would the most freedom they had to make maximum use of that as quickly as possible in as most agile way as possible was one of the criteria they would actually use in deciding whether they wanted to come and work in a particular university. So it's got a knock-on effect far beyond the simple financial impacts. It's got an impact on actually attracting people in the first place and also retaining them.
Yeah, in the same instance, in a situation where if a university has been looking at a particular area of research over a long number of years, they will have the facilities in place and the infrastructure in place, albeit not the individual particularly to carry it out, and therefore they are already fleet of foot because they have the infrastructure in place, rather than, as you're trying to suggest, that it would go to another institution that would have to start from scratch or from maybe a lower base than the existing university that's a centre of excellence. So it's a matter of balance, is it not?
By nature, research is normally leading edge, so it often requires new purchases of equipment and services and knowledge. Sometimes knowledge to be brought in, but very often a lot of very expensive, very specialist equipment has to be bought for a research project. So it's these areas, and that's where the bigger research projects are, and it tends to be built up. The knowledge and the thing that sells the university's research is actually the quality of the research team, and the team are mobile. So although they could be there for a long time, they can also disappear overnight and take their research with them.
Can I ask you what you think the appropriate threshold should be then in order to ensure that we're not making the environment in Scotland less competitive than in the UK?
My opinion is that the European threshold's low enough. I mean, obviously that doesn't help as far as this bill's concerned. I think that the bill threshold for transparency, as it currently is, adequate advertising and making sure we invite competition is fine. I think it's when it comes to the procedures around debriefing and the remedies, as Angus has explained, it would be very easy for somebody who had lost one of these infrastructure equipment contracts to then cause some difficulties for their competitor who just won it. And that, I think, is the worry, is the behaviour of the market as well as the nature of the threshold. So we're not concerned about increasing competition at lower thresholds. We're just concerned about the statutory extra obligations beyond our competitors in the rest of the UK and in the EU.
Yeah, interesting, because some others will say that we don't go far, that the bill doesn't go far enough in regulation and in You know, we've heard that already, and I've no doubt we'll hear that again. And, you know, when it comes to things like the living wage and 0 hours contracts, you know, universities are very much in the forefront when discussions on these things come up. So it'll be interesting to see how the evidence goes as we take the bill forward.
Particular point about wages and contracts. I mean, the University of Edinburgh now has no 0 hours contract. That's their policy, to have no 0 hours contracts, and we're working through that. We've also got...
That must be quite new, is it?
It was, yes, very, very recently. We've also got... we've signed up as a university to the Workers' Rights Consortium, which is an American university-led organisation. I'm working with Angus and the Students' Association and NUS of Scotland are trying to improve a code of conduct for workers globally, so not just for our own staff but for suppliers. And we've already, in Edinburgh University, got 56% of our procurement spend that we manage with SMEs. And 80% of our suppliers are already SMEs. So we are encouraging competition all the time.
Sylvia, you've been waiting for a while.
Convener, in terms of your original question about the impact that we feel this bill could have, from a sustainability point of view, I think the first point that I would make is the significance of procurement to the sustainability agenda. It covers quite a broad range of issues, for example, climate change, fair trade and circular economy. And sustainable procurement, given the amounts of money that are involved in public procurement, sustainable procurement offers a real opportunity to make a difference on big issues like that. And indeed, a bill that encourages sustainable procurement is to be welcomed. And obviously, the bill does do this, especially through the Sustainable Development Duty and also the related community benefit requirement. And we are encouraged by this. We think this is a good start. We do have some comments about the specific text in the bill and where provisions could perhaps be strengthened. I know that we'll probably get the chance to go into those in a bit more detail throughout our discussions this morning. But in general, one of the main points we would make at this stage is really to encourage the bill to take the opportunity to stress the cross-cutting significance of sustainability, so that rather than just having it mentioned in section 9 under the Sustainable Procurement Duty, to actually make the point that it is a central consideration that cuts across all sections of the bill, particularly in reference to the strategy and guidance sections.
Yes, George, sorry.
Thank you. I would just say, in terms of leaders and senior elected members' views through the convention, is that they were broadly supportive of the bill. I think our political discussions between my political boss and spokesperson and the Deputy First Minister have been very positive. Previously as well, the President has made representation around the need for a degree of consistency between the duty of best value on local government as it stands at the moment and the duties that will come in via this bill. There's been a great degree of unanimous support through convention for trying to seek to enable public sector bodies to award public sector contracts to companies that pay the living wage. There has been concerns in a proactive way raised to the Deputy First Minister around the forthcoming procurement directive and the potential impact that will have around shared services, and also the need for potential harmonisation between the directive and a bill, just to ensure that we don't create two tiers of procurement with potentially conflicting duties and thresholds. And the final point that convention raised was not only as us as procurers, but what we have to procure for communities being exposed to potentially practices which aren't exposed to as great a competition as they would be. So say, for example, the distribution use of system charges that the two main legacy boards within Scotland in terms of electricity companies charge councils is done within a semi-regulated way by Ofgem, but can be the source of quite significant price increases within year without little explanation. We've been quite successful in lobbying those down in the past years, but it was also, we made representation on the basis that as procurers we're sometimes exposed to things that we can't procure or have to pay a cost out with a truly competitive market.
Alex, I'm not sure if you want to dig deeper or whether your questions...
They've almost been answered, but there was a couple of things I wanted to come back on just for clarification. One thing that was touched on originally by Susan Torrance, and I'd like to answer the question in a simpler form. Section 1 introduces a very prescriptive list of who this bill applies to and who it doesn't. Do you have any comments on that list, both on organisations and that are included, and perhaps some that, anything that you feel have been excluded inappropriately?
RSLs listed in that list, registered social landlords and housing associations, although the Scottish regulator, housing regulator is. We are caught, I think, under Section 3BB of the 2012 regulations, which gives 4 tests to do with control, basically, and funding. And they're sort of the 2 main ones that are used to consider RSLs. A lot of associations at the moment are not actually receiving public grants for building new homes for various reasons, and we're certainly not controlled as such by another public authority. We may be regulated, we may be, very public about what our activities are, but we are not controlled, and indeed our boards are not dominated by any other contracting authority, but are mainly volunteers or various folk from various walks of life, unpaid, who serve on the boards of housing associations. And I think, we've argued consistently, although I appreciate this all goes back to a 2004 case, the Commission versus France, where French housing associations were put under the microscope, and those European tests were applied, and they were deemed to be public contracting authorities at that point. And I think UK governments then decided that rather than test this in Europe, they would just accept the situation that RSLs were. And as I say, all 4 national federations in England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales ever since then have been arguing that we're not. And as I say, as our public funding in terms of grant to build houses has decreased, both in terms of the amount that we've been given and also in terms of the associations that are actually building, and a large number of our members are simply using their tenants' income in order to maintain and manage their homes and run their businesses, they really feel far more akin to charities, which are not part of the public contracting authority regime, voluntary sector, third sector organisations, where really the imposition of procurement duties that are far more applicable, as I say, to large-scale organisations, local authorities, national health trusts. I was very interested in the European, exemption for, or not exemption, but how some universities in Europe are not considered public contracting authorities, because again, the scale of their business compared with our members' businesses, there's just no comparison. It seems to me there's a lot of anomalies, and as I say, our members are extremely concerned that not only do we potentially have lost the European debate in terms of looking at European thresholds, but we're now seeing a lower set of thresholds in terms of the procurement bill. And if you look at the financial memorandum, I think it says there will be no net cost to contracting authorities because you're all doing this anyway. You're doing procurement capability assessments, you've got procurement strategies, and certainly as part of the Scotland Excel local authority procurement regime, that's all perfectly true. But as I say, it doesn't apply to 20-unit Abbey Fields or even some of our medium-sized organisations. They have procurement rules, they have ways of running their business. They're very keen to ensure that local communities, local SMEs get the benefit of as I say, the economic benefit they're able to put in, but it's done as part of them running their business, and it's good for their business in terms of competitiveness, getting value for money, not because they're seen as akin to large-scale local authorities, health trusts with multi-million-pound budgets. So that's a bit of a wander around that, but it is very complex. And as I say, I can't see us being listed within the bill or within the regulations. But when you delve into it deeper, it does go back to a 2004 Commission case against France and the definition of the term control.
Is there anybody else who has issues about inclusion or exclusion on that list? The brief questions that I wanted to just clarify were, firstly, do representatives around the table support the introduction of the new regime for below EU threshold contracts, and will this have implications for your organisations?
And training there as well, because one of the things that we've had highlighted to us already is that there's perhaps not enough training in the field of procurement. Yeah, Karen.
Our team actually trained or are training all the staff in the Borders Council on procurement through the National Vocational Qualifications, and we also do collaboratively all the procurement for Queen Margaret University as well as Edinburgh. And one of the things I feel that's a missed opportunity in the bill is an obligation on public bodies to make sure the procurement people are trained, and that they also, if you're a local authority, for example, an enterprise organisation, that you offer training to new businesses in Scotland so that they really understand the public procurement rules and how they should be bidding, and that they should be getting training and support to help them qualify the bids and bid for the things that they really have a chance of winning. So I think there is something missing in the bill insofar as the McClelland report and the whole procurement reform agenda was about improving procurement skills, and there isn't really anything about that within the current rules as written in the bill. Obviously I know the Scottish Government is investing in training and development, and that's a good thing, but it might be something that could be considered in the bill.
And finally, just to clarify, the thresholds that are listed within section, Part 1 of the bill, are you content with these thresholds?
I think the initial dialogue, the original proposal was that the thresholds would be aligned to the EU thresholds and be 50% of them. So for most public bodies, that would be half of the 174,000. What's actually arrived now in the bill is half of the central government threshold, which, well, slightly less than the central government threshold, which brings a huge amount more procurement activity within the scope of the bill. At the consultation stage, I think it would make quite a significant difference to the costs of administering it within contracting authorities if the threshold was set at 50% of the relevant EU threshold. It will also avoid the need to constantly review that and change it within government, because it will track the EU threshold for both works and for goods and services.
What would you do differently if the thresholds were different? I mean, it's supposed to be, we're all looking to get more open and transparent and give local firms more chance to bid for contracts and things. What would you do different if the thresholds were different?
Within this, because it's under Section 32, it's going to be the visibility and the right to challenge will be extended to all firms across the EU, and also others that are not in the EU that are also listed in the bill. So we're actually going to bring, where at the moment within Scotland you can actually, for that type of business, we can contain it within a local supply market, so invite local suppliers to bid. We'll now be required by law to advertise it publicly across the EU, and as if it was an EU tender, and also into these the countries which are also listed in the bill, and they will have the right to challenge it. So the amount of business that will be competing with Scottish business will enormously increase in this bill. And the further down you take it, the more risk you have of bringing stronger competition to Scottish business and having the opposite effect of what the bill is actually trying to achieve, which is to try, well, one of the things the bill is trying to achieve, which we very much support, of trying to encourage more participation and success of Scottish businesses. But I think we think it will actually have a negative effect because of the public nature of the requirement to advertise and the wider scope of the ability to bring challenges. So I think that's a real concern. I think I would suggest the committee should think through that one. But the threshold then will have the effect of widening that competition to lower level. It will also obviously have the effect of bringing in the additional work required within contracting authorities at a lower level as well. £50,000 is only £12,500 a year if it's a 4-year contract. So there's a lot of very small contracts are going to be brought within the scope of the bill. And I don't know whether that was intended or whether it's the way it's been written, but it's certainly it means, ironically, it's because it's the value of the contract, it means that some of the things that could now be in the scope of the bill, because they're 4 single £50,000 contracts that are above the threshold as well. So there's a bit of a crossover there that probably needs to be clarified.
Well, and then George.
I mean, I think that when we first were looking at the bill, I think the spirit was about how do we encourage SMEs, and how do we make sure they get equality of access, and how as government and tendering authorities we work with our supply base so that they have very good opportunity to win business. I'm just slightly concerned that what the bill's done is put in a lot of administrative and bureaucratic and ultimately legal things that don't actually, that are kind of negative. They're what you do if it goes wrong, rather than the focus on how do you make it go right in the first place. And the idea of putting money into training, certainly I would fully support. And we have got things like the supplier engagement programme, and I think there's probably more as centres of expertise and procurement communities we can do to engage with the supply base in Scotland to support it. And I would be interested in the supply base's view in terms of how they would see whether this more legislative framework works, or they would rather have a much more partnership arrangement, a much more trained arrangement, a much more encouraging arrangement. We use the procurement capability assessment to assess our own organisations. We could actually use that as a model to support Scottish businesses in terms of, are they fit to be able to tender for Scottish public sector contracts and to win them and be competitive for them.
George.
In regard to the threshold, I think when leaders considered their paper at convention last month, there was no issues posed. I think there was concern that there may be slightly unintended consequences which could be tidied up. For example, maybe supported bus services needing to be re-tendered at short notice over a long period of time could take you over the threshold, along with the changes that are coming through the system proposing in terms of bus registration. It may actually shorten either the timescale for doing that, if a supported service was handed back to the contracting authority, and also the potential to reduce from a de minimis threshold to actually utilising best value at the moment, and just whether those interactions have been fully thought through. We have flagged it up to Transport Scotland, but it's just an example of where lowering the thresholds may make it slightly more cumbersome to react quickly if a service is handed back that's socially necessary to promote inclusion and accessibility and mobility within certainly some of our more rural authorities.
Okay. Mary, would you like to?
Yes, witnesses round the table have touched on the sustainable procurement duty, but I wonder if witnesses could give specific examples of what the impact of the introduction of the sustainable procurement duty will have on procurement practice in their organisations, and also how they will ensure that the sustainable procurement duty doesn't conflict with the general duties under procurement.
I'm very pleased to say that our university is very strong on sustainability and social responsibility. We've had a policy on this for 10 years, and procurement myself sits on the steering group for that. So we're very keen on making sure that procurement is sustainable in all its senses. The university has been around for 400 years. We want to be here for another 400 years. So we're looking at things like the environmental, the social and the economic sustainability. We currently do that in all our procurements anyway. I think one of the challenges in the way the bill's drafted is regarding in section 9 and 19 talking about an authority's area. Because obviously that's very relevant for a local authority, but for a university with a global reach like Edinburgh, we're not quite sure how we would be able to demonstrate compliance with that. So I don't know if it's a drafting issue or interpretation of what is meant by considering the sustainable impact on an authority's area, and that's something we would hope the regulations would become clearer on. But in terms of the principle of sustainable procurement, it's something we're working closely with Scottish Government advisors and others to try and do the best that we can in those terms. But sometimes at the moment that may, based on legal advice I've been given, that may conflict with the current regulations on the EU if we're trying to drive business towards suppliers in a local area, as opposed to opening the opportunities, which we have to do under the treaty anyway. The treaty obligations are transparency across Europe. So as a principle, yes. As a practice, yes. But how the wording is, I think, is one of the concerns.
So do you think the wording within the bill should be changed?
I think it would be better, in my opinion, and we'll submit this in a written response, that it should be related to the authority's purpose. So the purpose of the university is research, education and knowledge exchange. And our strategy actually references our view of how we can do that sustainably. And so therefore our procurement would be supporting that aim as opposed to a physical area, which we'd have difficulty defining, because we're in 4 local authorities and we've got premises in 5 continents. So it's quite difficult for us to know what the area is. I don't know if that answers your question. Thanks.
Sylvia and then Susan.
That point that Karen's made about the wording around area, because that is one of the key points that we would make about the bill as well. It is important, obviously, to think locally as a starting point, but really being sustainable means thinking holistically, thinking across time and space. In other words, beyond our own backyard in the here and now. And we did, at the consultation stage of the bill, the text referred at that time to the relevant area, and we actually picked up on that and had concerns at that point. And I think we would have to say that the way the wording is now is actually going a step in the wrong direction, because, as Karen points out, by only looking at our own area, you can see how sustainability issues could arise. And to give a hypothetical example, from East Bartonshire Council, most of our waste is landfilled out with our area. It goes to North Lanarkshire. So in theory, under the bill, the way the wording is at the moment, we could procure a very wasteful product, for example, a disposable high-volume item made of non-renewable resources, and we could still comply with the Sustainable Development Duty because we would be landfilling it out with our own area. And as I say, that's a hypothetical example. I'm sure that wouldn't actually happen in East Bartonshire, and I'm sure that it's not the bill's intention to encourage that sort of thing. But as a society, I think it is fair to say that we do still displace rather than address a lot of our impacts, if not on our immediate neighbours, then certainly in our more distant neighbours. And if we interact with other countries, which as a trading nation and a member of the international community, that is something that we do, it is really our responsibility to preempt and avoid negative impacts that arise from those interactions. I think especially given the Climate Change Scotland Act and our recent Fair Trade Nation status that we've gained this year, through both of those measures we have made a very public and international statement that we not only recognise but we actually want to be world leaders in demonstrating how to be a good neighbour, and I think it is really important that the bill takes that into account.
Susan?
Housing associations in Scotland have sustainable objectives, whether that's building sustainable homes or sustaining people in their tenancies, sustaining communities and putting as much financial impact into local businesses as possible. I think it's fair to say that a lot of the discussions we have around Europe are how far away the idea of opening up housing association business to Europe, and the likelihood, because it's quite interesting as well. I did actually ask at the seminars how many associations following through EU procurement actually had ever had a bid from any other European country, and the answer was 1. And they had a lot more bids from India and China. Apparently there are Indian and Chinese companies that trawl through Public Contracts Scotland and the OU Journal. So in terms of the treaty objectives, if you like, of widening the markets and opening competition, there seemed to be a real failure, if you like, if that was the objective, for that to have actually have happened. But returning to the bill, I think that the biggest concern is that that sustainability is at the core of what we do, but actually having to then bureaucratically demonstrate how we do that, and also reconcile that with Europe. I think that's our biggest concern, which echoes, I think, some of the things you were saying, Karen, about just how the two marry together, because they don't seem to at this precise moment. And I would also support the idea of sustainable objectives as being the rationale behind your demonstrating sustainability, not just looking at area, because again we work in not necessarily local authority areas, but possibly Scotland-wide and even in some instances UK-wide.
Just from a health perspective, we're fully committed to the sustainability agenda, and as kind of part of the 2020 vision for health and the triple aims, including the innovation agenda as well. So from that perspective, I've got no kind of issues with what's in the bill. The only one I have got a concern about or a comment around is this notion of the geographical area the authority's area. If you're a national organisation like us, our area is Scotland. And we have to work very closely in our case with our health board colleagues to ensure that we're not driving competition and unnecessary competition between regions. And particularly if you take food as an example, we will buy food products from Scottish suppliers. In many cases, health boards and councils may want to buy from a local supplier in their area, and there's a lot of work needs to go on to reconcile and make sure that we're getting the proper sustainable options as well as driving best value options at the same time. So I'm just slightly concerned about narrowing it down to an authority's area, and I think it reflects Sylvia's point about a more holistic view to sustainability.
Yes, Dorothy.
Over the same ground, sort of share Colin's concerns and Sylvia's points, but I think for me, just linking back to something you said earlier, Convener, Scotland Excel can cope with all of this sustainable procurement. I think we need to think about the resources that we put into working with individual public sector bodies, councils and health boards, making sure that we've got the right training and guidance and that that's funded appropriately. I think that will make the difference. We work with Sylvia's organisation and also with the Scottish Government and their the procurement journey, and I think one of the things we've talked about doing on that is greening that and making sure that the guidance that everybody follows has got sustainability at the heart of it. So, and I think that needs to be properly resourced and invested in, and then those messages embedded in individual organisations, and we need to reflect on the funding to make sure that that happens appropriately.
Dorothy, can you maybe take a few minutes to explain what Scotland Excel is and how it came about, and how it came about to be based in, what is it, Renfrewshire or wherever?
Of course.
Before,
I'd be delighted to. We came about as a result of John McClelland's review of procurement and public sector in 2006, and part of his recommendations from that said that each of the various centres of public sector should have a centre of expertise, because procurement was being done in a very fragmented way. And that was the basis upon which Scotland Excel was set up. When we launched in 2008, we had about 25 or 26 of the councils on board, and over the course of the next couple of years, we worked hard to get the remaining councils on board. So we've got two kind of key strands of our business. One is to deliver collaborative contracts on behalf of those 32 members. And that's not all of their contracts. We are currently working to develop contracts worth about £750 million. Councils collectively spend about £5.3 billion a year. So we don't do all of the councils' contracts. An awful lot of that work goes on in individual authorities or with authorities clustering. But that's the key thrust of our business. And the second part of our business is working with councils to help them get better at procurement themselves. So over the course of the last 4 years, we've been working with them doing the procurement capability assessments and moving them up that procurement maturity curve, where in most councils, when we started, procurement was very much a kind of tactical, operational function, and we've been working with councils to help them see procurement as being a strategic enabler and helping them to drive best value.
Particular areas of procurement that you kind of specialise in and to help councils, or?
It's across the range. I mean, we have a vast range of contracts that we do. We've got about 40 in place at the moment, and those range from very operational contracts, so all of the materials that are used in schools, musical instruments, mats, wheelie bins. That was the kind of original contract portfolio that Scotland Excel started with. But clearly, most of the money that's spent in councils is on either construction, social care, ICT and increasingly waste. So we've been moving into those areas over the last couple of years. So our contract portfolio now has a number of contracts that relate to the provision of social care, fostering secure care contracts on behalf of local and Scottish Government, prepared meals, and we're in the throes of doing a contract just now for residential care for children, as well as some early ventures into the engineering side of things. So we've got a building consultancy, engineering consultancy contracts in development.
See, we've heard in evidence-taking sessions here, and also prior to this bill coming forward, that Scotland Excel doesn't encourage sustainability and localism, and that you actually work against, local residential care providers or local charities in providing care for vulnerable children, because the contract is done by Scotland Excel and not by local councils. What would you say to that?
I would disagree with that view. I think there's a perception, and Scotland Excel has to work hard with its stakeholders to manage some of those perceptions. But we work really closely with councils, and all of our contracts are structured on the basis that we don't insist that organisations have to be able to supply the whole of Scotland in order to participate in our contracts. So they're all structured on the basis that if you can only supply Argyll and Bute, that's the box that you tick, and you don't get any fewer points because you can only supply one council, and those that can supply all 32 don't get any more. So we try and structure our contracts and our lots to make sure that we don't impact particularly on local SMEs. And I'll give you a really good example of that, where that structure went even further than local authorities. And one of our contracts is for butcher meat. And we recognised that the landscape for Scotland, there's a lot of small local butchers participated in that. So some of the local authority areas were subdivided into further lots. And Argyll and Bute, for example, I think was something like 10 or 11 sub-lots within that, so that we made sure that those organisations that were currently providing to that council still had an opportunity to participate. In terms of our commitment to sustainability, I hope Sylvia will support what I say in terms of we're very committed to it. The Scottish Government's the Sustainable Procurement Action Plan had some aspirations in that organisations got to a certain level within the sort of national flexible framework in relation to sustainability. And that's a kind of mark your own homework approach. It was to get to level 3. It's a 5-stage process. Level 5 is the highest. Scotland Excel has put a lot of work in to get to level 4. And we invited Barbara Morton, who's a well-respected expert in sustainable procurement in the Scottish Government, to come in to check the marking of our own homework. And we had confirmation that we are operating at level 4, so sustainability is built into our processes as we go through, and that was externally verified earlier in this year. And I'm not sure how many other organisations have done that, but Barbara Morton gave specific reference and praise to the work that we were doing, particularly on contract management. So I think we've got a bit of work to do to manage some people's perceptions about what Scotland Excel does.
It's not just perception. I mean, if a contract is awarded to a UK-wide charity for, all the local authorities in Scotland and can't provide it, let's say, in Aberdeen, the people who suffer are the vulnerable children or adults who are supposed to be covered by that contract. And you find that the local charity who's done it for X number of years and perhaps was just very slightly more in cost, has to lay people off, has broken the link with those people that they're looking after, and it is not, working for the people that it should be working.
I'm not sure if you've got a specific contract in mind, but if I take the residential schools contract that we're currently working on, there's been a huge amount of consultation with key stakeholders in that process to make sure that we understand all of those things and we take them into account in how we draft the strategy moving forward. So I'm not aware of us having displaced any charities in any of the contracts that we've been developing to date.
Gordon,
yeah, on a similar vein, I've had a couple of companies, small companies, come to speak to me regarding the procurement bill, and similar comments to what Maureen said. Previously, this was in the area of flooding and giving advice to local authorities about flooding. Number of companies who previously had contracts with a large number of local authorities on an individual basis, as soon as it was rolled up into Scotland Excel and presented as one contract, they suddenly found themselves excluded. And therefore that level of expertise that they had gathered over a long number of years was lost. And their concerns was the measure of value for money. It was partially around the fact that it was an hourly rate comparison, which didn't take any account of specialist knowledge or the efficiency. They might have a higher hourly rate, but because of the specialist knowledge they had, they could actually complete the contract quicker, and that wasn't reflected in the frameworks. In addition, they found that small companies were being measured against large multinationals, and they were of the opinion that that should maybe be split, so there was an allocation for SMEs, maybe 30% specifically for them, and the SMEs should be measured against SMEs, and the international companies or national companies should be measured against national companies, so that there is a greater scope and opportunity for SMEs to come on board, rather than what seems to be happening is that under the Scotland Excel umbrella, they're being squeezed out.
I'm very aware of the circumstance that you've mentioned, and I think there's a lot of detail that sits behind that I'm not sure this is the appropriate forum for going into that. I think our responsibility is to make sure that we provide SMEs with an opportunity to tender, and then there's an obligation on them to make sure that they submit a competitive bid, and I'm happy to give you some information in the background if that's helpful over that particular case, because it's a well-rehearsed example. And in terms of allocating specific proportions of our contract to SMEs, that's not something that we're able to do under the legislation. So the obligation, I think, on us as a procurement community is to make sure that we structure things in such a way that they have a fair crack at the whip in order to do that.
George and then Sylvia.
Thank you. Just in terms of carrying on the issues about what local authorities are doing to stimulate sustainable procurement, I think certainly COSLA and Scotland Excel have had quite detailed discussions over the summer about how we can support the emergence of the circular economy within Scotland and furthering the zero waste agenda through how we procure our waste services and how we try and offer up opportunities for SMEs within Scotland to access the agenda that Mr Lockhead and Mr Swinney are seeking to promote, about trying to make use of a greater amount of our resources within Scotland, treat them within Scotland, and keep our waste, turn it into resource and offer economic opportunity. And that's something where councils are trying to work through procurement. In terms of your original question about the sustainable procurement duty, when members have considered this through various executive groups within COSLA, I think the overriding view was they didn't oppose it, but they did question when we have a general duty under the Climate Change Act already, just that any duty that came forward under this Act shouldn't be contradictory or hamper us in any way or cause unintended consequences, because members spoke quite unanimously at convention for their strong support for sustainability, procurement being a key tool to promote that, and recognised that again through endorsing the voluntary Scottish Climate Change Declaration, seeking to achieve our national and local targets on carbon reduction and sustainably procuring. I think just to finish in terms of the comment around training, in terms of the transposition of the EU directive, we've been made aware that the UK government may allocate funding on that basis to local authorities and relevant bodies, and we've been lobbying through our Brussels office on that basis for a fair share of that to come to Scotland if that is the case.
Thanks, Convener. Just to pick up on Dorothy's point and also to reflect what George has just said, in terms of Scotland Excel collaborating with Sustainable Scotland Network, I would like to confirm that Scotland Excel has had a long-term involvement in the Sustainable Procurement Working Group, which is a group that sits within SSN, and we've had some fruitful discussions and events over the years in relation to training and also contract development and monitoring. And one of the things that we've been working on recently is the personal and protective equipment contract. We've actually been advised that what we've done with it is quite groundbreaking, in that we've written in a requirement for fair trade or ethically sourced items to be made available, and that's really involved, you know, quite a turning point in terms of supplier and buyer understanding, and we're really quite excited about, you know, the opportunity that we've had through Scotland Excel to do that, and as I say, we've been told that it is pretty groundbreaking, not only in a UK level but actually across Europe, and we're working with ICLEI at the moment to develop a case study based on what we've done. There is of course scope to do more. There always is with sustainable procurement. For example, the circular economy agenda and the training agenda that George and Karen have mentioned. But to go back to the earlier point, I think the bill could help us in that regard, especially if the suggestions that we've made are taken into account.
Mary, anything else? Sorry, Angus.
Just a couple of things, really. One of the things, obviously, that we very much welcome in the bill is a drive to support innovation. I think one of the key things there might be to make maximum use of the increased enablement of be able to use a formal process for developing innovation in the supply chain and the new EU directives. And that I think there'd be value in something in the bill in allowing a degree of discretion around advertising where people are dealing with these new innovations, because it would allow contracting bodies in Scotland to work with local companies that have great innovations without putting it out to a European competition for that business, and allow it to incubate at least for the first run of the contract. So I think that if there's something in the reform bill that mirrored the new concession within the European legislation, I think that would be very useful for supporting SME development.
Sustainable procurement duty.
There is, but it doesn't actually mean, it doesn't give you an ability to not advertise in the public domain the requirement. If SME comes to you at the moment with a,
you know, that means that you're deciding who the people are who might be innovators, and you're not opening it up to other people who might be innovators.
Yes.
By advertising.
Yeah, I mean it's a balance to take. I mean, do you help to incubate these local organisations that are developing things that might be new technologies, or do you put that technology in the public domain and allow anyone to bid? And again, it's a question: what is the best thing for the local SME community? I would argue that having a degree of protection for at least the first letter of an agreement, where there's I mean, obviously you'd have to be able to justify this in a court of law if challenged. So people would have to be very careful about not making it up as a reason to not public tender things. But there will definitely be innovations being developed by organisations in Scotland that the public sector could help to incubate in at least the first letting of the agreement.
Karen. Particular point, I agree with it in principle. I think the challenge for our sector particularly is that we are where a lot of these innovations begin, and some of them are things where, for example, university may have part of the intellectual property rights and may have partnered with an investment angel or someone to set up a company, and then if that company's opportunity is open to competition, then the kind of concerns that Angus has mentioned could come to play. But there are legal exemptions at the moment for those things. But there is a lot of work going on at the moment in Scotland on these innovation centres, and we're hosting one, and we're working with NHS and Glasgow School of Art on interpretation in the current law about how can we make sure that we're open to invite companies to come forward with their innovative ideas in a kind of open forum before we end up closing off procurement and competition. So I think it's more complex than perhaps it would seem, and it certainly is important that the Scottish Bill doesn't prevent that at a lower value of spend than we're currently able to do at a higher value.
Mary?
Well, that's been a very useful discussion for me. The only other thing I wanted to ask, and if you've already covered it, I do apologise. Do the witnesses round the table welcome the provisions to publish procurement strategies and annual reports?
Very much so. I think it's something that we should be very open and transparent about. And at Talk for Health, we have just recently developed a strategy for procurement as a function within health, rather than 22 health boards and ourselves all having our own strategies. And I think we need to be open and transparent in that way. I think providing contract registers and things and contract plans going forward should help suppliers see what's coming along the chain, be able to forecast, be able to look at what they'd be interested in. A slight comment on it is just that people need to understand these strategies can change, contract registers can change, contract plans can vary slightly, but outside that. I think the only thing I'd mention around it, and that the bill does cover it, is rather than having 22 health boards in our case, all having to write a strategy and all having to produce a report, we would probably look at trying to do it as a health community to cut down on the administration and cut down on the, but also give something that's more meaningful and joined up for health as an entity. But as a principle, it's something we would welcome.
Dorothy?
I suppose one of the benefits of doing that is that some of the urban myths that I was talking about will actually help to dispel that. So most of our information is in the public forum anyway because of the nature of our structure, but I think having it in a place that's along with everyone else would help do that.
So can I take it that everybody agrees that annual reports are a good thing, to just move on?
The only comment I would make is that our members would find it extremely difficult to write some sort of standard procurement plan or strategy that could be adopted by every member, simply because of the diverse nature, size that I've referred to already, and also, as I say, because it's part of a procurement regime, if you like, that we're not necessarily have adopted in the same way as local authorities and health boards. So we do think it would impose an additional burden on us. We've no problem about publishing information.
That through annual strategies and reports, that transparency and accountability would be encouraged, and that's obviously a good thing. We would make the point that, as we mentioned earlier, there are existing measures that have an impact on people's procurement activities, including reporting and monitoring. And Dorothy mentioned the procurement capability assessment earlier. That is one way that that local authorities at least are being held to account already on the sustainable procurement front. And I think it would be important for that to be acknowledged in the bill. Is the flexible framework is the mechanism that the PCA uses, and I think it would be important to take that as a starting point, and also to recognise the importance of the climate change declaration monitoring, which again is something that all local authorities take part in, and which we are looking at building procurement monitoring into. So from that point of view, perhaps a degree of flexibility would be welcomed.
We already publish our overall procurement strategy at the highest level. We publish our sustainable procurement risk assessment, which complies with the flexible framework, and the outcomes of that are reported as part of our sustainability strategy. So we're already doing this. I think the area we touched on before, some of the things that are done do have commercial confidentiality and so on, and I know within the bill there's the right to withhold information within debriefing if that's the case. I think perhaps there ought to be some wording around strategies, just for the odd exception where you may not want to make public something that is maybe planned to be procured, for a new infrastructure, for a competitive research project, for example. It would be the exception, because the general procurement strategy would be published.
We'd support that very strongly. I think the publishing of strategies is a very important thing we already strongly encourage. I think it's widely used already across our sector, so it's not so much a change. The timing might be of when it's done, but I think it's a very good aspect of the bill.
Okay, if we can move on to specific duties then, Jim.
Convener, I think we've covered a lot of the issues already in our discussion, but I'd like to just clarify some points, if I may, and that's around the specific duties on contracting authorities that are set out in Part 3 of the bill. In understanding the potential additional burdens that may be placed on contracting authorities around bureaucracy and cost that have been mentioned already by witnesses, I'd like to understand where these challenges lie. So we've talked about the thresholds. Can I just be clear that the additional burden, as you see it, is from placing all contracts on the Public Contracts Scotland register? Is that one of the additional burdens that you...
I mean, that's a relatively minor aspect of putting it on is a simple bit. It's the then knock-on impacts on resources of doing that. It's the work slightly some of the work before that around sort of the duties of doing local economic impact assessments and things before you go to market, before you place that advert. But also the impact on by putting it there, you will widen significantly the number of organisations which will take part in the competition, which in theory is a good thing. But obviously, I won't go over the ground again, but it will also massively increase the number of people bidding for business from a wider field, and dealing with these, and dealing then with the impact of then the debriefings, which I won't go into again because Colin's already mentioned it, but the debriefing impact.
Purely covered that, right. Okay, thresholds, because I want to run through this fairly quickly. The requirement for contracts above 4 million to be compliant with community benefit requirements, that isn't an issue, is it?
On that point, my main concern about that, and to having taken legal advice, is currently that is above the European threshold for goods and services, and obviously the committee will need to consider, from their own legal advisors, what does that mean if we are bringing in for goods and services community benefits that maybe currently don't quite fit with the current European law, although the European law is expected to change in this regard. For works contracts, it's very close to the works threshold for EU, so it really doesn't affect our view of the works contracts particularly. But if we're buying goods, would we have to consider, if we were spending, and we don't, but if we were spending £4 million on stationery, for example, would we need to consider the community benefits for that?
So is it a challenge or not? I'm not quite clear from what people are saying. The requirement to comply with community benefit for
goods and services, it would be better if it was linked to a goods and services level of threshold. So that's my opinion. It's just a little bit of confusion, and it may be that it can be sorted out in a final drafting.
I think the bill intends it to apply to works. I think that's the fundamental principle, and I think there's probably clarity needed to make that clear. I think one of the things that's the challenges will be around community benefits of something around sort of £4 to £10 million areas. Say, for example, a build there would have quite a short duration, so you wouldn't have time to put in place sustainable community benefits situations like as apprenticeships. What currently happens in some occasions like that is that the people will employ apprentices for the few months duration of the build, and then they will dismiss them, and then they've got nowhere. They can't complete their training. What would be valuable would be if there was a national body coordinating apprenticeships, so that all these small bills could be put together and an apprentice could then go from job to job. And I think that could be...
Construction Industry Training Board, it's called. They do that.
Yeah, I mean,
but, aren't universities going to benefit from this as well, in terms of your students going out to civil engineering contracts and things?
A large number of students who go to graduate placements and who are, employed in all sorts of industries. I think community benefits isn't something that we would worry about. I think if it's clarified, if it's related to works contracts, I think how the industry manages it, as Angus said, is an issue, but I think it's a positive thing.
So in summary, sorry, just to be clear, so that you've had the opportunity to say where you think the potential additional burdens will arise from the legislation. The level of thresholds, bringing procurement activity that's not currently within the scope of regulations within the scope of this bill, provision of debrief information, the additional burdens that flow from putting information or all contracts on the Public Contracts Scotland portal. These would be the main issues. Any others?
I think there's a way around it. There's a positive thing that could be done. The Procurement Contracts portal could be amended to give a rapid debriefing to companies online, where they could log in and see a very quick checklist of they'd failed on price, quality, service, whatever, and then follow up with a freedom of information request specifically about what they want, and they would get the answer in 20 days instead of having to wait a longer period. And I think there's ways that could be done to be more beneficial and simpler and less bureaucracy than trying to fulfil a full EU-type analysis for every single bidder. And I think, to highlight what Angus has said, in the years that I've been working at the university, the number of bids we're getting currently before the bill, even on lower or EU-level tenders, is growing and growing. And sometimes we have 80 companies and only one is going to win at the end of the day.
George.
Just in regard to community benefit clauses, I think convention and leaders hugely welcome them. I think their concern was that they, through the drafting of the bill and the wording, they weren't onusly prescribed, shall we say, and just had the ability to reflect local circumstances. I think that was their main concern. So it was support, but just with the expressed wish to lobby further on retaining that flexibility, given the range of circumstances that exist across member councils.
Guidance, I think, has been in existence since about 2008. But our members, in terms of the confidence of actually following through some of the obviously in terms of apprenticeships, in terms of giving employment to local folk, that's at the core of what they do. But the confidence to actually do that and understand how that then, engage with EU treaty obligations, I think was the biggest concern. So I think our members saw the bill as an opportunity, if you like, to actually specify things in greater detail and give greater clarity and confidence so that they could then incorporate clauses, because that's what they would like to do. So.
Gordon, do you think your question on recyclability has been answered, or do you want to explore it further?
Well, we can give them a chance to. Part 3 of the bill contains an amendment to the Climate Change Act, which gives ministers a power to make regulations to ensure that a certain proportions of goods procured by contracting authorities are remanufactured or reused goods. What impact would this regulation have on your organisation? And what effect will this regulation have on the use of recycled and recyclable products?
George.
I think when members have considered this previously, that there has been general support for that, given our support for the Climate Change Declaration. I think it's qualified slightly in regard to what types of goods and services. If you're having to procure recycled computers, then there is a question of the impact upon, will it be the fastest processor, would it enable you to do work? But in terms of timber procurement through local councils, there's very much something there about they're wanting to see recycled and reused materials coming forward. So support, but it will just be, I suppose, in the detail of the regulations that there could be exclusion of certain goods and services. But there might be a mechanism through the circular economy discussions to try and enable those to be reused and recycled in other economic development, and maybe secondary impacts through procurement as well.
Recycle and reuse products within the universities, so they actually stay in this sort of cycle of economy. Our furniture, I can't remember exact percentage, but a large part of it is reused. Our computers are cascaded within the university before they're suitably either offered for resale to charitable bodies or dismantled in a way that allows the components to be reused. And we also are very keen, as part of the climate change, to make sure that we're minimising waste, and we have been very successful in doing that. So I think as long as those who are making the regulations actually do consult with procurement and technical specialists on which elements can be procured in a recycled manner, and really take account of things like the United Nations Marrakesh method, which is a way of looking at sustainability in the whole, because one of the worries about things, and I'm sure Sylvia can add a lot to this, about things that are being reused or recycled, is it actually sustainable the way it's being managed? So I think so long as the regulations are not too prescriptive, it is a positive thing.
And then Angus.
Yeah, just a number of things I was going to say have been said. I mean, I think generally from health we would support the principle of recycling. I think that the key for us is that, I think it was a point George made, that we engage with our stakeholders and the users of products before we buy anything from them, or buy anything for them, I should say. So it's ensuring that what we buy is fit for purpose, and as long as that we can meet that criteria, then the recyclable thing is something very positive. And I think maybe just a general issue that this brings out, that the real devil is in the detail as to how it's then, once the legislation's passed, how it's enabled from there. And that's the key of working with government, to understand and not make it too onerous and make it workable. And that, I think, applies to a number of the elements of the bill.
Do you want to come in on this?
I think I think as long as it takes account of the category, and I think as long as it's done with expert advice on each category, I think it's very welcome. I think what it would also be useful to do is to have a stepped set of targets as well, so that it's clear, looking out over a number of years, where people should be aiming towards, so that people can start to plan in the things that they start to buy now, that they're buying things that can then be recycled or refurbished at the end of their life, so that they can see that they can build on it. Yeah.
Sylvia, have you got anything to say on this?
I suppose I would agree with everything, all the various good points that have been made, and maybe just to pick up again on Karen's point about recyclability and about the fact that you know, recycling is at the bottom of the waste hierarchy, as it were, and that if we're talking about trying to minimise the impact of waste, then really what we should do first of all is to try and reduce it. In other words, not use items at all. But if we have to use them, which obviously we do in a lot of cases, then to think about reusability and, you know, to keep recycling as a second last option to landfill.
Okay. Adam, have you got any questions?
Yes, I think we've already discussed the remedies regime and the issues that you have with it. But I'd like to turn it around and ask you, well, how can you fix it then? What would your be? How would you adjust the below EU threshold, the remedy regimes for those contracts? Just take them out altogether, or I think it was Colin that suggested that there was a suggestion about an ombudsman perhaps being appointed for that role. So
we have a single point of inquiry at the moment, which is a, you know, if my language is right, but a kind of informal process that allows, or a formal process, but it allows suppliers to raise a complaint without having to go down the route of you know, a legal recourse. And that complaint is followed then up, and it's actually the centres of expertise that are responsible for investigating the complaint and feeding back. There's I mean, I think it's worked in some cases well, in other cases not, and maybe it needs more power. And actually, probably maybe it needs to be able to then go to consistent authorities who are consistently complained about, right, and start questioning and looking at their processes and what are they doing, and that perhaps that's the way to deal with it, through you know, tackling it with authorities who maybe are not contracting in the appropriate way. And I think just the points I made earlier, the other issues, whether we try and turn it around and have a more robust supplier engagement and supplier management processes that are encouraging suppliers, that are kind of education programmes, etc., that work with them. Because it goes back to the point I made, I'm not sure that small suppliers see the ability to go to court as a solution, because of the potential. If they lose, they could end up spending a lot of money on a relatively small value contract. So it's trying to find something that encourages SMEs rather than gives them an option that might not be in their interests or might not be favourable to them.
No?
I mean, I think the single point of inquiry, for which predominantly focuses up to now on above EU threshold activity, although it doesn't necessarily have to do that. I think it's been a very well-respected solution run by the Scottish Government. I think it's trusted by the suppliers, it's trusted by contracting authorities, and it gives people a very balanced outcome from raising their concerns. That then it must have avoided tens of millions of pounds being wasted in legal fees by the supply market on cases where they would have lost. And I think that is a very, very good remedy process. Beyond that, the law already allows them to, if they have genuinely been mistreated, to seek damages, and that would obviously continue in law anyway. So I think that's, but the single point of inquiry, I think, has got an essential role and a very valuable role to play as part of the remedies.
To support what's been said already, but also say that the investment that the Scottish Government and all the sectors have made in the reforms since 2006, with having centres of expertise, has actually made it easier for suppliers to find out why they've been unsuccessful, because they can approach a central body, or they can approach, in my case, somebody like myself, if it was a procurement done by one of my team, and they know that the information they're given is then likely to be able to be used in future contracts. So we're better at debriefing suppliers than we were many years ago, because of the knowledge that we're in a procurement community, and if someone is debriefing a supplier in a way that's maybe not accurate, then the next time they bid for someone else, they would be in a position to challenge it. So I think the procurement reforms have had that desired effect. But obviously, as Angus said, legal action for damages is still there. It's currently the law for companies. But the worrying part for all of us, you've heard already, is the idea of somebody vexatiously trying to stop a competitor winning business.
That are in.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
We need to roll back from the regime that the bill is seeking to establish. And that's one of our tasks, you would reckon.
Yeah, I think so,
Okay.
and have more open communications without necessarily statutory detail.
Okay, thank you. That's clear.
Mark.
Yeah, heard already about particular sectors who should perhaps be excluded from elements of the bill, but do witnesses think there are any sectors who should be covered by the bill, and if there's any enhancements which could be made to the bill to include any further provisions?
I'm tempted to answer that question myself, but I'll come back in at a future meeting.
Is over what, say for example, the UK government bodies which are based in Scotland. What scope will the bill have over them, and for other publicly owned bodies like the Royal Bank of Scotland, for example, who are publicly owned, and should they be brought into the scope? I think the answer. I know what the answer is, but I think it's worthwhile asking the question.
Suggestions which we'll put in a written response regarding not necessarily bodies but other ideas. I mentioned already training and skills, and I think there ought to be a requirement on the business development communities in Scotland to invest in helping SMEs with public procurement. They already have the obligation, but I think it could be made stronger. We also, as Scotland's first fair trade university, think there's an opportunity to emphasise a little bit more the International Labour Organisation standards or other aspects of behaviour in terms of procurement and services to people or through people. And the last point I would like to make is that there should be some obligation, I think, put on the supply community to be more transparent on things like pricing and breakdowns of margins. I know it's something that's guarded very much as a competitive element, but if the public are spending money with a company, I think we should be entitled to know a little bit more about where are the various elements of price, delivery and cost, so we can be more efficient and actually work together.
It's maybe not an organisation, but I think leaders and convention were they were unanimous in terms of saying that they wanted the living wage to apply to all forms of that they could do through procurement. They recognised the existing legal issues, but I think there was cross-party support for trying to do something where, at best, we encourage the payment of the living wage through procurement of public services and works, but recognising the existing legal frameworks that we're in.
That brings me on to my next point, just to ask members as well what they feel the implications of the proposal to be able to exclude bidders from your organisations, to talk about that generally, and also whether, going back to the point about an enhancement, whether an obligation could be put on companies who are bidding for contracts through that exclusion, since it applies to blacklisting or zero-hours contracts, whether witnesses would support another line on contract bidders for contract paying their staff the living wage, and whether they could be excluded from contracts if they didn't.
I think as the law currently stands, they can't be excluded. The one thing we have to be very careful of is that we don't make Scottish businesses uncompetitive versus businesses south of the border as well. Even if we had the legal power to include it, we need to think, well, does a Scottish firm suddenly become sort of 15–20% more expensive, and therefore a company in Carlisle will win the business? That's one of the practical implications of it, I think. And how far down, how far, in what geographical areas do you impose the living wage? Do you say that a company who's making things in India should pay the Scottish living wage? It's a challenge, and I personally would support as many organisations as possible paying the minimum wage, but I think it's a very challenging area to deal with.
Just in terms of the living wage, just to really reiterate that leaders accepted the legal framework. They are looking at ways of encouraging the drafting of the bill at the moment. I think seeks to say that you can take into account levels of remuneration where it may affect the quality that company is likely to provide. But we have had detailed discussions with the civil servants who have been drafting the bill over a number of months. I think their clarification legally was that it couldn't be done via the treaty because it would be above the minimum wage and therefore not be legally permissible. But having said that, I think leaders were saying, have we examined every opportunity that we can? And reference was made to the Welsh Assembly, perhaps trying to utilise community benefit clauses to pay the living wage. But again, there wasn't a technical discussion at the political meeting about the legality of those potential approaches.
Just really, I think, the ethical issue of the minimum wage, it's probably not a procurement question to answer. It's just the concern really that Angus said, particularly in health, we're kind of competing in world markets. A lot of the products that are provided to health are made by multinationals, pharmaceuticals, health products, health technology products. So there's a risk of making us uncompetitive, making Scotland uncompetitive, and how do you manage and administer something that's got a minimum wage requirement when you're buying from really anywhere across the globe? So a kind of practical issue rather than a kind of comment on the living wage itself.
I think said what needs to be said in terms of the living wage, and obviously we comply with the political direction that we get. But I just wanted to come back to the first comment, which was about the exclusions. And I think anything that comes through the bill that gives us a bit more clarity about what we can and can't do to exclude people is extremely welcome, because it's a very grey area at the moment.
We can.
Exclusions that we've been in the Procurement Policy Forum discussing at length, what information are procurement officers or managers expected to get from the likes of the police and so on if people have been conducting criminal activities or blacklisting. How do you actually get hold of the information to be able to exclude companies if they've if they've not actually gone to the point of being formally charged, and is that relevant? It may be that we just can't do that, and therefore it'll only go so far as companies that have actually broken the law. As far as the living wage is concerned, we gave a response to the original consultation, and one of the challenges is not just the things that colleagues have said here, but the fact that we were talking earlier about apprentices, people employed by companies, for example, decorators and so on. If they're working so many hours on a public body and then so many hours on a non-public job, will they get paid different rates of pay? And in a way, it would be better if we were able to influence the minimum wage to be a living wage, which would bring it in line with the International Labour Organisation standards.
Okay, anyone else? Susan?
Housing associations support the payment of the living wage, but I think we would need to be very careful in terms of consulting with the many sort of charities and voluntary organisations that supply services to us. Obviously, they'll be employing staff and we expect them to be properly remunerated, but there's a huge concern in terms of the third sector about the impact of the bill on just how associations and, as I say, charities and support organisations will work together going forward in terms of the thresholds. So I think that's another added issue that, as I say, we would need to consult very closely with them on.
Okay. Any of my colleagues got any further questions? No. Well, can I thank you all very much for your evidence today. It's been most helpful, and we will take it into account on our Stage 1 report. And as I said at the beginning, if there's anything you think you've missed, please put it in a written submission. And I temporarily suspend the meeting to allow witnesses to leave the room and to move into private as previously agreed.